name is Melissa Jeter, Librarian Specialist for the Art Tatum African American Resource Center, located in the Kent branch of the Toledo-Lucas County Public Library. Welcome to the Art Tatum African American Resource Center's Oral History Project, the Edrene Cole Collection. Dr. Edrene Cole was a local African American historian and educator who began collecting the stories of noteworthy Toledoans in the African American community. With this oral history project, the Art Tatum African American Resource Center honors her memory and her work. Join me and University of Toledo Professor of Anthropology, Dr. Willie McKether, as Toledo's very own African Americans share the stories of their lives.
Hi, I'm Dr. Willie McKether. In this segment, we're pleased to welcome Reverend Robert Culp, pastor of the First Church of God in Toledo. Pastor Culp, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
My privilege.
Pastor Culp, I'd like to just have this conversation with you and to talk about your life and experiences here in Toledo. I know that you were not born and raised here, but you arrived to Toledo in 1961. Under what conditions did you come to Toledo?
Actually, I had candidated at a church here 2 months before.
Okay.
They had called me. I belonged to a church group that the individual church contracts with its minister.
Okay.
And after I'd visited, they invited me back to take the pastorate. So in May of 1961, I moved to Toledo, Ohio.
Okay, good. Okay, when you arrived here and took on the church and became involved in the community, I know that was a time of sort of heightened racial tensions throughout the United States, not just Toledo. But having that in mind, what were the conditions in the community when you arrived?
I found Toledo to be a rather laid back and easygoing kind of town. After I'd been here a few months, I recall saying to someone, with the migration from the South, obviously Alabama folks populated Toledo, well, so do they populate Detroit? And I used to tease them and say that Negroes that didn't have what it took to make it to Detroit, they stopped off in Toledo. But it was a rather easygoing place. They did not, what you didn't have either way, black or white, you didn't have the kinds of tensions that a lot of communities had grown into.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, that the civil rights movement was in full bloom by the time that I'd got here.
Absolutely.
And my philosophy was basically based on, well, Dr. King actually had impressed me. I was raised in a church that pretty much kept the world and the church separated. But King, who I had a chance to meet early on while I was a college student in Indiana,
Really?
helped shape my worldview. And one is that God loves not only his church, but he obviously loves his world as well. And as churchmen, we had a responsibility for not just the spiritual life, but the total life of people. My approach to pastoring was that I came here with the long term in mind. I intended to make Toledo my home.
Okay.
I told my church first Sunday I was here, it was till death do us part, that I really came to stay. So my first 5 years here, I kind of neglected the church and spent it getting to know the community and getting involved in the community.
Sure.
And after that, got much more involved in the life of the church. But I needed to get to know the people that were in my church, and I needed to get to know the people in this community. So it gave me an excellent opportunity. They didn't press me on it. They were very open-minded and didn't mind the kinds of involvements that I got into. I became active immediately in the NAACP. In fact, when my 5 years were up, It was when I was elected the president of the local chapter.
Is that right?
Yeah, in 1966. Just served one term. Here, I found people to be in civil rights movement. They lionized you the first time around. They criticized you the second time around. Then they crucified you the third time around. So I served one term, and it was an exciting time for me and in the life of this community. As you would realize, about the time I was winding up my term was when Dr. King was killed.
Right.
And set off an awful lot in the life of this community.
In fact, I want to ask you about that because I've asked several people. Few remember that there was a disturbance that occurred in like late 1960s, and they weren't sure if that was maybe tied to Dr. King's assassination or not. Do you recall a disturbance in the 1960s that occurred in Toledo?
Yes. As I said, at that time I was the NAACP president, and if memory serves me right, the primary disturbance started with high school kids at Scott High School. The students had asked the principal, who was a elderly Anglo man, to lower the flag to half-mast. And he refused to do so, just told him to go back to class.
Uh-oh.
Well, bad move. And interestingly enough is that I learned what was happening from a policeman who came to my home with instructions to pick me up and see if some of us could help quell. They went down, the students en masse came out of school, went down Dorr Street, down Collingwood to Bancroft. At the corner of Bancroft, there was a car wreck. There was a number of things that happened there that physically endangered white persons. Sure. They were headed to Robinson Junior High School to turn it out. At that time, my church was immediately across the street at Grand Avenue, Grand and Waite. And so we camped out there as the students arrived. And it's interesting of how small things make a difference.
Yeah.
But the two primary leaders of the students headed to Robinson were youngsters whose grandmothers were members of my church. And to this day, the police department can't figure out how I got that mob under control. But I simply said to those two boys, if you all don't calm this group down, I'm going to tell your grandma. And literally, we took them to Braden Church, which was a much larger church right around the corner at Lawrence and Woodruff, and had a rally there, and scheduled another march from Braden downtown, and kind of got things, at least with students, under control.
Sure.
But things broke out again, either that night or that week, a major riot.
Sure.
Mayor Finkbeiner was a social worker then for the poverty program. And he suffered severe physical damage.
Did he really?
Night. Yes, he was injured that night by a group of rioters on Upper Dorr Street at that time.
Because it seems, from what I understand, there was a lot of fires and looting and burning of black businesses, which seemed to be counterproductive. So is that?
Well, which was part of our problem back then. We probably couldn't have done much damage anywhere else.
Right.
In terms of the force that would have been used. So you're right, most of the damage was done in the black community. Upper Dorr Street was looked like a war-torn area after that night.
Sure. Coming to Toledo, in 1961 and continuing to work, do you think that you were ever perceived as that outsider who's coming in trying to do too much?
Basically, no, because I tried to slowly work my way in. I only, even though I was a clergyman and a pastor, I only got involved, especially at any leadership level, at the invitation of whatever particular group was involved there. And that helped a great deal. I made them ask me to serve in any real role or, and take any leadership position. So that, you have to remember, back in the 60s, black leadership was not chosen by black people. It was really chosen by the majority community. And the moment I became the NAACP president, which, by the way, I also at that same time happened to be the president of the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance, the black ministers as well.
Sure.
And both groups were well recognized by the majority community, so that you inherited leadership with those roles in the community. And interestingly enough, is black people pretty much acknowledge that as well.
Okay, okay. You know, it sounds as though, I think you even indicated this, that you brought a culture of church or the pastor's role in the community. Was that common for other pastors during that time?
Not really. Not only that, I was pastor of what was called a holiness church. And the holiness camp and holiness movement had little or nothing to do with civil rights. Pastors were sometimes a bit hesitant to get involved as well. Just happens that here, Reverend A.L. Roach had been a president of the NAACP in the past, so I was not the first one. So there was some exposure to the church being involved. But most churches and church people had little to do with civil rights things. Dr. King had a tremendous impact in that day and time, in my view. His role was easily as earth-shaking as Obama's role is in this generation, in this time.
Absolutely.
He changed the way church people thought about themselves. And, the church was often accused that, our role was to promise people, what was it, pie in the sky by and by. Well, he changed all of that and said, we're God's children, intended to live as human beings with all the rights and privileges of citizenship right here and right now.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. Let me ask you this. Upon your arrival, and even since then, have you ever sensed that black churches were stratified in the sense that some churches were sort of the churches for the more elite or the more educated? Do you ever have a sense of that?
Yes, there always has been that in the black church. Some things are a bit of a myth, others are actually so. I've never seen it where they, you hear the word that in some churches, if you're too dark, you can't be a member of that church.
The blue vein churches, right?
Yeah. But I've never experienced that, but I have known them to be what you call traditional churches or high churches.
Okay.
We had a Baptist church that when I came was pretty much known. Their worship was of a certain style. Their membership included most of the black leadership. There was kind of you're right, a stratifying. It's when they came to town, it's as though you looked for your church where your kind of Negro was worshiping. And so, yeah, that much was pretty true. You knew when you went to Third Baptist, there was a certain person there. If you went to Jerusalem Baptist, it was a little different. At Third, you knew the hymnal was going to be used.
Absolutely.
At other churches, they didn't bother with songbooks.
Sure.
You knew the song and you sung it.
There's no hymnal. I know, and especially with this Methodist tradition, is very sort of, okay, hymnals, certain page you follow it and you don't get out of that.
Yep.
How progressive I guess, has your church been? And how progressive should churches be in general in reflecting the needs of the community, especially of different generations of people in the church?
Yeah. I feel that I was very fortunate to come when we had some wonderful churchmen, the established pastors who had the so-called large churches. They were excellent men with real character, and they cared about people. So I had some good mentors. Samuel Coleman at Mount Pilgrim Church, Johnson, A.G. Johnson at Friendship at that time, Mount Zion's pastor, Elijah Benton. These were giants, wonderful men, and had a strong, especially Reverend Johnson, had a tremendous involvement in the community. Introduced me to the Board of Community Relations and politicians and these kinds of folks who they opened doors for you and taught you how to really deal with the broader community back then. I was just 26 years of age, didn't really know and understand that awfully much about churches, less more about community life.
Certainly.
But these men were, and back then, the Ministerial Alliance met every Monday.
Did it really?
So I'd block that time off to be sure to be there, because it was not simply taking care of the Alliance's business. It was learning how to pastor a church and how to preach and how to handle yourself in community. Let
me ask you a question. This is sort of related in terms of, there seems to be, in some aspects, a number of smaller churches sort of emerging now where people are now sort of not claiming to have been called to the ministry, and they don't have a lot of mentoring and training. Mm-hmm. What kind of training should a person go through who's a new pastor?
I came from a family, I'm originally from Pennsylvania, where my grandmother and grandfather were very interested in education on my mother's side. Mm-hmm. So that she was a real driving force. When I finished high school, even though I was the seventh child, I was the first one to go to college. But that's because I was an athlete and I could get aid to go to school.
Oh, certainly.
Most of my brothers and sisters wound up with college degrees, but it was only after they were grown, had a job, could go to evening school and that kind of thing. Sure. So I had that family impetus. So I went to college. No question that I was to go to seminary after I finished college. Mm-hmm. Was not typical. In my particular church group called the Church of God, I was the first graduate of our church seminary, first African American graduate of our church seminary. So there were those who had inspired me at that point. But my generation was probably the first one where it became rather common for clergymen to go to seminary, not just to college.
Okay.
Prior to that, you were called by God. Your message, He inspired your messages, and
sure.
you didn't take. Back then, the standing joke was they asked you, were you a graduate of a cemetery? Kind of deal, as though seminaries deadened your spiritual life, not. And back then, seminaries weren't very good at teaching you how to pastor. They teach you how to preach and gave you a wonderful theological background. But people skills, well, you had to learn them, hands-on kind of work.
But I guess part of this also, there was a certain amount of mentoring that's also necessary to become a good pastor.
But what the black church has lacked, and it's finally beginning to turn a corner because we have enough large churches. But when I came along, you could count, I cannot remember a single full-time associate pastor, especially a young man going into ministry. It had to be a process over the years where when finally the pastor died and you could succeed him kind of approach.
Sure.
The Anglo Church has always recognized the value of training and hands-on training. The best thing that happened for me before I came here, I pastored a little town in Illinois, Danville, Illinois, and that was my training ground.
Okay.
I had 12 people, and boy, they nearly turned me gray in my 20s back then. But it was great experience, and it's necessary, because if I hadn't had that experience, I'd have never lasted here.
Absolutely. Well, let me go back. At what point in your life did you realize that you were called into the ministry? And how did you know it?
Yeah. For me, it was quite young. I became a Christian, what we call conversion. I accepted Christ at 11 years of age, just a youngster. The evangelist was only 19 years of age, and he became my spiritual mentor. I made a commitment at a revival service on Sunday night. On Monday night in that same revival, he had me up leading the church in prayer.
Really?
I was 11 years of age. But at 12 years of age, I really sensed that God had a plan for my life that included ministry. And I spent a year as a 12-year-old really wrestling with that whole idea of was I to be a preacher of the gospel. It wasn't a matter of finding. One of my friends picked up a piece of paper by the curb one day, and it said on it in big letters, "Go preach." So he said that was his call to preach. You know? Well, I didn't find any paper with preaching on it, but I had this inner urge about it that I took to my pastor and shared with them, took to my parents and all, and they told me to take my, so I wrestled with the whole issue during my teen years.
Sure.
And I made the decision by the time I was finishing high school that I really felt that God was calling me to it. One of the things I believe about a call is it's a recurring thing. You can't get rid of it. It finds a way to working itself back into not only your life, but into your conscience as well. Sure. So you got to wrestle and deal with it. And mine persisted all during my teen years. So by the time I was 17, instead of going with an athletic scholarship to play ball at a school in the South, I wound up going to Indiana to school to prepare for ministry.
I was going to ask you, if you were not a pastor, what would you have become, you think, in your life, in terms of a career?
I think like an attorney, very logically and orderly. The dean of the law school at TU, almost literally camped on my doorstep. I have an appeal. I have several attorneys. The senior elder in my church right now is Judge McConnell. When I came to town, when I was the NAACP president, we met. He was a science teacher at Woodward High School, going to law school. But they invited me to Woodward to make a civil rights speech. And he followed me back to my church. And I've always had lawyers in my church, and I'd have gone to law school.
Law school, you think?
Yeah, but I knew if I did it, the school here, back when I was a youngster, offered me all kinds of incentives. But I knew if I did, it would interfere with my ministry, and I was very committed to ministry.
Sure. Well, you think at some point you still may do some part-time teaching or lecturing?
Yeah, I actually love teaching, and several persons who spent their careers at the university, I'm close to and work with them right now. I enjoyed it a great deal. I'm getting ready to retire.
Okay.
Next a year this month now. We put it off. But I do plan to retire. I wrote myself a note when I was 19 years of age. I heard a pastor beg for his pastorate because he had no provision to retire. And the church still voted him out, and it broke my heart. So I wrote myself a note that when I turned 65, I was going to retire, and I was going to have made provision for it. Well, between that time and time I got to be 65, I realized times had changed, and 65 was no longer old.
Absolutely.
So I changed that and wound up staying with it now. But I will, as some say, it's not retiring. It's a retread job, you know. So I have plans for things. I still plan to stay in Toledo, but I'll not be a senior pastor.
Well, how difficult will it be for you to walk away? I mean, not sort of, you won't turn your back, but just sort of take a, you know, you won't be the senior pastor. You think you'll have separation issues?
It won't be easy because it's been my life. The advantage is my congregation has always been involved in the community. Let me rehearse quickly how that started way back in the 60s. In 1968, McDonald's opened up their territory. In Cleveland, they had a boycott, a protest, and a man got killed. It was very negative publicity for McDonald's.
Sure.
And they sent word across the country, open up the territory.
Okay.
So it just happened that Bert Rose and his partners, McDonald's have to be owner-operated facilities. All best you can have is a limited liability partnership. So he and his partners, we got together, and they made available the Central City. There was only one store at Door and Auburn at that time. It was the only Central City McDonald's. And they sold us that store in this territory. James and Helen Cooks were our first managers for that McDonald's. Well, back then, and this was actually a reality, McDonald's had no competition back then. And we had rounded up between 75 and 100 community people. I probably got the first 40 from my own church and another 50 from the community who bought shares in a corporation.
Okay.
Bob Kaplan, a local Jewish lawyer who's still alive, incorporated us, helped us to really get it organized. The Stranahan family stepped in and enabled us to come up with enough capital to, because it cost us $250,000 way back in '68 to buy a McDonald's.
Did it really?
Yeah. But McDonald's were so lucrative that you had to mismanage it to keep from making money. I mean, that's you didn't have to do an outstanding job. You just opened the doors.
And people would come.
Made money.
That's right.
So we used it. The corporation was called Christian Brothers Development Corporation. Jack Dale, a local mortician, was our vice president. Just a group, James Caldwell, Clayton Umbles, a group of local black businessmen, lawyers, Dr. John Coleman, just all of these persons all joined together with it. Because I'd been here by then long enough that they had confidence that this preacher
Knew what he was doing.
Yeah, really cares about the community and will do something with it. And so we then established on Dorr Street, we had a grocery store. We bought I think it was an IGA store, and called it, well, back then, you remember the Jolly Green Giant?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, our store was called the Black Giant. So we said, come to the Black Giant where you save your Jolly Green. That was our theme for it.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and then we had an appliance store on Upper Dorr Street in the 1200 block where many businesses were. And then further up near Upton, we had a meat market as well. We had a restaurant at when Franklin Park Mall first opened, a restaurant called Good and Plenty. We over on Indiana Avenue in the 1200 block, we had a small factory that painted transmission cases for Dana, and we also had a contract. Back then, business had a conscience, and we didn't have to compete for business. They gave a certain percentage of their business to us.
Wow.
So because of the McDonald's, we had all these other businesses. So your next question is, what happened?
Absolutely.
Well, what happened was McDonald's caught on that we were not an owner-operated McDonald's. So they required us to sell it. So we sold it to the cooks, who sold it to what's his name, that just recently died. He was the one that really had branched out and with McDonald's. But anyway, with the loss of the McDonald's, it was really carrying all the other businesses. None of the others were profitable.
Sure.
But were great opportunity for jobs for persons, and we started out, part of the history is that a lot of young blacks had no record, they had no business acumen at all to draw on. So rather than 8 hours a day, we worked 4-hour shifts at our factory, for example, and we never paid on Friday. We had to wait. We waited till Monday to pay them. You know the reason for
I understand
that.
completely.
Yeah. But it was a great experience, really was. And after we sold the McDonald's, really, it was, and we sold each of the other businesses to the management of them, and that most all of them. Back then, there were very few black businesses that were not undercapitalized.
Certainly.
You had to be prepared for losses. As you know, all successful businesses start out that way, and we didn't have funds to be able to capitalize them properly. So almost all of them, after a couple of years, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, they were gone, except the McDonald's.
Well, you talk about economic development. I mean, creating jobs, training people. I mean, just seems to be seems to have been really just a wonderful outfit in the community. But you know, do those kind of collaborations exist today?
Yes and no. One of my contentions has been is that if an area has a spirit that seeks to dominate it in certain ways, where, for example, they say that gangs are unreal in Los Angeles. I mean, the kind of size and power and all involved. Well, in Toledo, it's almost been a spirit of division, of separation, of isolation. And African Americans have suffered from that terrifically here. And so bringing them together has really been difficult. But we found from a church base, it's helped. Now, about, well, more than 10 years ago, 4 churches came together and formed another corporation. The churches were United Missionary Baptist, Friendship Baptist, New Light, Church of God in Christ, and First Church of God. Well, the first thing we undertook to do together was the Toledo Urban Federal Credit Union. That's how it was born.
Really? Okay.
Yes, from that corporation, the Covenant Community Development Corporation was the group where we churches formed together. And then a couple of other churches joined with us, and we worked with the Catholic community. The old St. Teresa's on Dorr Street, just across Detroit. In fact, the new credit union's going to be built on the corner of Dorr and Detroit. Well, our corporation gave the land to the credit union just recently because we purchased, through Marcy Captor's help, we bought the old St. Teresa, the church, the school, and the rectory. And then we purchased a gas station that was on the corner. So that short block we owned. Our real intent, if funds hadn't dried up about that time. Funds, federal funds were drying up. But if it hadn't been for that, we were going to develop that whole area from the University of Toledo was involved in Calvin Lashy. They moved a few classes into that school building there for us. And we were from Dorr to Indiana, from Detroit to whatever the next little street is past Detroit Avenue there, was the development that we were going to really for the whole community there. But that group of churches came together, set up the credit union, a group that still exists called Covenant Youth Development, works with kids through juvenile court, came about through that particular group. There were 3 or 4 endeavors that this group has undertaken. So economic development, we've toyed with it, tried to develop it here in this city for a long time. Sure.
Well, it sounds as though, and I think you've proven that the role of the church extends beyond the 4 corners of the church. There's an obligation and responsibility to the community in which the church is located. And I think that through your leadership in many ways, that has come true in Toledo. Well, Pastor Culp, as we begin to wrap up here, I guess is there anything else that we've not talked about that you think is significant for the context of this discussion?
It's probably that I found in Toledo some really great and noble people who to me, not merely kept us alive, but really have made it possible that one day we could really thrive in this community, who I found to be great spirits and great people, not only in the church community and among pastors, but there were a few others as well. I have a daughter who's a pharmacist. The reason that she was able to make it through school were people like Ella P. Stewart, who every black youngster who wanted to be a pharmacist, she either provided it or made arrangements for them to be able to get schooling. Great souls like that, and this town has been blessed with a few of those kinds of people who really made possible a better quality of life. And I can name a few others, some who were involved in politics, some who were involved in church life, some were involved in the business community. But they were great spirits, and I really have enjoyed my nearly 50 years in this community because of these people and the opportunities. I was a youngster back then, and they could have excluded me and all, but they were kind enough to not only teach me a lot, but then when time came for some of us to move into certain leadership positions, they were right there to encourage you a great deal. And so I've enjoyed my stay and see the future being even better for this community.
Well, Pastor, I think that you have made tremendous contributions to this community. You are now one of those great souls and great spirits. You've provided opportunities for others, and this community, both of all ethnic groups, are better because of you. So
thank you.
Thank you much, sir. Appreciate it.
Okay, sir. All right.